All right, I guess I'll get started. I want to welcome participants to the afternoon session of the Water Institute's annual World Water Day celebration, which could not have happened without the generous support of the RBC Foundation. On behalf of the Water Institute, I want to begin by acknowledging that the University of Waterloo is located on the Haldimand Tract, which is on the traditional land of the Neutral, the Anishinaabe, and the Haudenosaunee peoples. In 1784, almost 1 million acres of land extending 10 kilometers to either side of the Grand River were promised to First Nations people. Today, they have autonomy across roughly 1/20th of that promised land. We acknowledge that injustice and the continued injustices faced by Indigenous peoples here and around the world. Now, we're all here because we care about water, so it's important to also acknowledge the role Indigenous people have played in the conservation of aquatic ecosystems and their watersheds for centuries, and the roles they continue to play in conservation today. The Water Institute operates with the understanding that gaining new knowledge about the land is a shared goal with Indigenous communities, and the Institute actively seeks meaningful relationships for better outcomes. And to that end, I want to stress that we welcome Indigenous community members, particularly youth, to participate in today's discussion. My name is Dan Riskin. I'm a biologist, I'm a writer, I'm a science communicator. You may have seen me on the Discovery Channel, where I co-hosted Daily Planet for 8 years. You may have seen me on Animal Planet as the host of Monsters Inside Me, a disgusting show about parasites. Or you may have seen me more recently reporting for CTV News or W5 about a broad range of science topics. My passion, though, as hinted by the picture I have in the background, put there just so you'll notice it, my passion is bats. And some of my most cherished experiences involve catching bats around bodies of water where it's easier to find them. So I'm thrilled to talk about water today with Dr. Johnson and to talk about being a scientist and about communicating science. But before I get to all that, and before I formally introduce Dr. Johnson, I want to give a little context about what's brought us together today. Each year, on March 22nd, the University of Waterloo's Water Institute hosts a World Water Day celebration focusing on the importance of water for human, environmental, and economic health. It's also to raise awareness of the 2.2 billion people living without access to safe water. Established in 2009, the University of Waterloo's Water Institute facilitates collaboration, supports excellence, promotes innovation, and champions interdisciplinary approaches in addressing complex water challenges. The Institute's research represents an enormous breadth of disciplinary expertise with a membership of over 170 faculty members and more than 350 graduate students who collectively span all 6 Waterloo faculties. So now you know a bit more about the Water Institute and you know why we're here. So let's get started. Dr. Ayana Elizabeth Johnson is a marine biologist. She's a policy expert. She's a writer and she's a podcaster. She earned a BA from Harvard in environmental science and public policy and a PhD in marine biology from the Scripps Institution of Oceanography. Dr. Johnson has helped develop policy for the Environmental Protection Agency and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And she was a co-author of the New Blue Deal, a roadmap for including oceans in climate policy. She is founder of Urban Ocean Lab, a think tank for coastal cities, and is co-creator and co-host with Alex Bloomberg of the podcast, How to Save a Planet. Elle magazine named her one of 27 women leading on climate, and Time magazine just included her in its 100 Next list of leaders who are shaping the future. Outside magazine has called her the most influential marine biologist of our time. Dr. Johnson has a new book out. It's called All We Can Save. I have my copy right here. It's co-edited with Dr. Katharine Wilkinson, and it's an anthology of essays by women working and living at the forefront of the climate crisis. So I'll welcome Dr. Johnson to turn on her microphone, turn on her camera, which is now the equivalent of walking out on stage. There she is. Big round of applause. Good to see you. So just before I get into the meat of this, I just want to talk a little bit about the format of how this is going to work. Normally in a setting like this, Dr. Johnson would have just walked out. We would have all clapped, and then she and I would have a back and forth.
I'd be wearing shoes. Probably.
You'd be wearing shoes. Exactly. And normally I would ask all my questions, then we'd open it up to the audience for questions. But we have an opportunity here because of the weird format of the pandemic. So we're going to shake this up. So audience members, You can submit questions in real time using the chat function. I'm not going to look at the chat because that's too garbunky for me. So our team is going to curate those questions as they come in. They're going to go into this other document that I have open to the side here. And if I'm looking at this screen, that's what I'm looking at. I'm going to see the questions as they come in, and I'm going to work them into the conversation. So don't think of this as something you're watching. I really want this to be a conversation you're part of. So submit your questions via the chat function on Zoom. Okay, Dr. Johnson, thank you for coming. Is it okay if I call you Ayana?
Of course. Yeah,
all right.
That's great.
Well, okay, good. Well, I'm Dan, so that that works out perfectly. So,
Andy.
First of all, welcome to Canada. Now, I understand that I know that you're a proud New Yorker, but you also have Newfoundland roots. Is that right?
I do. My mom's parents grew up in Newfoundland.
Really? Have you been there?
I'm planning to go in August if things go according to my plans, to take a road trip up and see the place. Meet some second cousins and hang out on the water.
Right on, right on. Okay, so let's get started with your origin story. You decided to be a marine biologist when you were 5 years old. I think a lot of people make that decision when they're 5, but very few stick with it. So how did you end up fulfilling your dream when others didn't?
I love that framing. Sorry for all the people who didn't fulfill their dreams, I guess is like the first thing. And I think I did because I could. Yeah, I mean, I had every opportunity open to me. I grew up in Brooklyn, as you mentioned, in a working class family, went to a great school, and we couldn't afford to really go on many vacations, but the few we went on were always to the ocean. And my dad is Jamaican, so they were always to the Caribbean. And so we went to Florida when I was 5, and I went on a glass bottom boat ride. I saw a coral reef, and I saw these like crazy, ridiculous looking, colorful fish. And I was just completely in awe of this other universe happening beneath the surface. And, decided then and there to become a marine biologist. But I think a lot of kids who have a delightful ocean experience and learn that marine biologist is a thing that could be your job, have that curiosity. Like, it's a pretty common dream job. And I guess the thing that made me decide to stick with it was realizing that I could actually do multiple dream jobs at once if my work was ocean conservation. So it was like the civil rights work and the policy work and economics and as well as science. And so that was really interesting to me. How do we weave together all these disciplines and solve the puzzle of like, what does sustainable ocean management look like? What does that entail? And you need to like understand and collaborate with people who have expertise in all those different disciplines. So that's how I like ended up sticking with it, is perhaps more interesting than how I started. Because a lot of people take that first step, and then there are many reasons along the way that people get discouraged, or doors are closed to them that shouldn't be, or life has other plans.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so what I'm understanding then is,
can you imagine if every kid who wanted to be a marine biologist actually became a marine biologist? We would know so much about the ocean.
Yeah. There's nothing wrong with that idea. I think that would be a fabulous scenario. And were the world one where more kids who did have that dream could become that? I mean, I think that's part of it. But what I want to come back to is what you say there is that as you learn more about the world, you sort of grabbed other stuff and made it part of that dream. So the dream evolved as you continued down that road. Yeah. That's great.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess I'm probably one of the few people who got a PhD in marine biology and never intended to do research after graduating. Like, I never wanted to be a research scientist. I always wanted to learn as much as I could about ocean science so that I could use that understanding to inform policymaking. to protect coastal communities and cultures, to think about like, what does ocean justice look like? We now think about environmental justice and climate justice, but like, what would ocean justice be? And how could my understanding of the science help me to be a productive part of these policy decisions, that I could like know enough to not necessarily be doing the super detailed long-term studies myself, but to understand what they mean. I can read the science and help translate that. And so that's a kind of a weird path to take, to go like all the way through a PhD with like no intention of doing any experiments after getting it. But for me, it made sense.
I want to do a poll because I want to get our audience involved here. And so the question for everyone here is, what about this career path idea? So are you still on a career path that you chose before you were 10 years old, with the understanding that the career path might have changed, but, so a yes here would be yes, and it's changed, or yes, it's exactly what I imagined, or a no would be more like, I had dreams of playing in the NHL and I'm now working at Wendy's. And it's complicated would mean you don't fit either of those. So why don't we go ahead and do this poll? I guess I'll have to.
You know what I wanted to be when I was 10? I was just learning about the US civil rights movement. And I decided I wanted to be the lawyer that got the next Martin Luther King out of jail.
Ooh.
That was my dream job at the age of 10. I wanted to be a civil rights lawyer. I thought I could be like really helpful and maybe not get shot and like help people get their rights.
Wow.
So.
Well, here we go.
This is
Here's
a
some.
pretty good split here.
Let's see. So yeah, so we've got about half of people say no, they're not on that path anymore, and half of people say yes, or it's complicated. Depending on whether you look at the complicated as a half full, half empty.
Complicated people.
Yeah, that's what the next interview will be, who they are and what their story is. But it all leads to interesting things. Okay, so all right, so some people in the audience have also this shared idea of like getting on a path when they were young. But I mean, you talk about how great it is to have all these different branches to what you're doing and how they feed together into that nugget of a career as it moves forward. But you can't tell me you were 5 years old and you were like, I got to get involved with policy. I'm really, I see those fish and I'm like, I just absolutely have to help pass some legislation here. So why do you put so much energy into the policy side? Why do you think that's where you should be investing your energy?
So it's funny, it wasn't when I was 5, but it was actually quite early on. I found some essays that I wrote in middle school when I was at my mom's house last year. And it's remarkably consistent with the things that I'm writing and saying today, like embarrassingly so. Like my thinking has not transformed as much as I might humor myself into thinking that it has. Because once you find out that essentially the game is rigged, it makes sense to think, well, I need to help change the rules of the game, right? If all of these corporations are getting away with polluting our air and water, or overfishing, or whatever it is, you think, well, clearly the rules are wrong if we're allowed to take so many fish that things are going extinct, or if they're not being enforced, or if some communities have to do with pollution and others don't. Like once you start to have like a deeper and deeper understanding of the ways in which things are broken, and like accountability is missing, then policy becomes like a pretty obvious thing to care about. I don't know that I ever thought I would be on the inside of that though. I think as a kid, I thought I would maybe like be upset about the rules being wrong and maybe like yell about it. But I never thought I would be like have the jobs that I mentioned, like working in government, or collaborating with policymakers on ocean policy. So that is sort of like an unexpected delight that people are so open to input. And I think the reason that is because there just hasn't been nearly enough collaborative work, especially at the federal level, on ocean policy. Like most of the environmental policy attention in the press, certainly in political campaigns, is around climate or pollution, or land-based stuff. And because I'm working more on the ocean side of things, people are like, oh, we should think more about that. Like, tell us what you think. And so that's been, it's been surprisingly easy to get involved, I would say.
Will you tell me the specifics of your involvement with Elizabeth Warren on the new Blue Deal? Like, what is that document and how did that come together?
Yeah, I love this story because to me it symbolizes the ways in which we can each just show up and offer whatever skills we have. So during the US presidential primary, we had all these candidates for the Democratic position who were competing essentially for who had the best climate plans, which I was delighted to see. This is the kind of competition that everyone benefits from, right? Over the course of the primary, you had all these people leveling up their climate proposals. And this was, right after the Green New Deal resolution was introduced in Congress by Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in the House, and then in the Senate by Senator Ed Markey, who's been working on climate policy for decades. And so they introduced the Green New Deal resolution, and I read it, and it's only like 13 pages long, double-spaced, massive font. I know a lot of people talk about it, but very few people have read it. It'll take you like 5 minutes if you want to read it. It's on the internet. And then we can have like the informed conversation of like, is this even a good idea? Do I like some parts and not others? How would we make it better? And so I was glad that it was so short, but I was not glad that it took me until page 10 to see the word ocean. And it was mentioned just as like a list of things we should protect, blah, 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 ocean. And I was really bummed because if we do not include the ocean in climate policy, like we just will be leaving out so many potential solutions, right? If we aren't explicitly thinking about offshore renewable energy and restoring and protecting coastal ecosystems that protect us from storm surges and sea level rise and absorb all this carbon, if we're not thinking about regeneratively farming the ocean in addition to land, right? We're not thinking about algae biofuels and all of these climate solutions that are left off the table if we don't think about the ocean. Because we often think about the ocean as just like a victim of climate change. We think about the water getting warm or acidifying, or coral reefs dying, or fish having to move towards the poles. And all those things are true, but it's also a hero, right? So I was like, the ocean is my hero. It's a climate hero. It's absorbing all this carbon. Like, how can we leave this out? And so I teamed up with this fisherman who's now an ocean farmer growing seaweed and shellfish, who is thinking about the same thing, and the CEO of Surfrider, who's also thinking about the same thing. We co-authored an op-ed called The Big Blue Gap in the Green New Deal to just lay out all these missed opportunities. And that caught the attention of this policy think tank called Data for Progress. And they did some polling about, how Americans felt about this. And turns out Americans wanted the ocean to get more attention in climate policy and for conservation, and the jobs that are associated with those industries developing sustainably. And we wrote about the economics of this and like the economic opportunities of this, what if we had a blue New Deal? And then during the Democratic primary, there was a climate town hall that CNN hosted. And each candidate, had 40 minutes or whatever. They were asked all these questions. And one of my co-authors for that op-ed, Brent Smith, ocean farmer, like recorded a video of himself asking a question, and they chose that question. And it just happened to be played for Elizabeth Warren. And he basically said, I make my living on the water and the ocean's left out of the Green New Deal. What do you think about a Blue New Deal? And she said, that seems like a great idea. And then all of a sudden on national television, she had said, I want a Blue New Deal. And her policy team then called me and said, apparently we need to write a Blue New Deal plan. Will you help us?
Right on.
And so that's how it came to be. And sort of like then, I helped to co-author that plan. And because no other candidates had an ocean policy plan, it became the gold standard, and other people were sort of in favor of it. There weren't like competing proposals that came out. And it was one of Lauren's most popular plans. As someone who's known for her plans, that was apparently the one most often mentioned in selfie lines. And so then the work became, when she left the race, to make sure that the Biden team was carrying forward some of those ideas and then into the administration. So it's just been exciting to be a part of gathering these policy ideas and making sure they're carried forward no matter who's in charge.
That's really inspiring.
I just showed up and just started writing things and collaborating with people. There's not like, no one invited me, no one like told me it needed to happen. Everyone just sort of like pitched in what they had.
You just did it. That's amazing. I have a question from our audience. Madeline asks, what's your view on accountability or the brokenness of policy change? Have you had to compromise on the policies you want in order to be involved with government decision making? So it's all fine and dandy to dream lofty dreams and say what you want, but politicians are famous for not doing it and saying all these reasons it just won't work. I don't have to
compromise, but I also know that I won't get what I want, which I guess is the difference, right? Like I can continue to advocate for exactly what I think is needed. And I can't compromise sort of like with myself. I think that's where we get into trouble. Like if they are only willing to go 80% of the way there, then that's better than zero. So I'll take it, but I'm never going to tell them 80% is enough. I'll just say, thank you. Like, and let's work on the next 20, right? So amazing. I think that's the role of someone who's on the outside, right? We say, no, the bar needs to be here. And they say, well, we can give you this. And you're like, fine, I'll take that. And also like, let's keep it going, So I think,
right on.
I think like policy making is like a perpetual iterative process, right? It's not like someone says Blue New Deal, yes or no once, and I get to decide whether I want like whatever version they're giving me or not. It's like there's many chances. I mean, we're running out of time to get our act together on climate and species protections, habitat protections, all of it. Of course, there's an immense urgency, but taking 20% or 40% now doesn't necessarily mean you can't get the rest later. And so I try to see it more as a process of building relationships of, even if you don't get any of it, you can start to change the public discourse around how high the bar should be set, or, what kinds of policies the public is advocating for, so that politicians know that when they're responsible to their constituents, what their constituents even care about. So I guess I see it as a bit more fluid and iterative than perhaps the question implies, but I could be misreading.
Well, I think that's really clear. I mean, you're making the distinction between yourself as an advocate compared to the people who actually have to balance the needs or the voices of different groups, and it just makes sense when you phrase it that way, why you'd be able to just speak the truth and say what your professional opinion is, and try to push things in that direction. And you're, I mean, by putting yourself out there as a voice, you sort of you change the narrative, right? And so you just you just mentioned
the idea. I don't know if it's working, but I'm trying.
Okay, so in that spirit, let's talk about the ocean as a climate hero. I mean, you've talked about the ocean as a source for solutions before, and this sort of turns the whole thing from victimization of Mother Earth to good news, to the ocean having these superpowers, so this Wonder Woman. And so can you just walk us through exactly how you make that statement and how you can turn the narrative that way?
So basically, like, when we think about climate change, it's often really depressing and scary because it's overwhelming, right? Like, what is the future of life on Earth going to look like if we keep burning fossil fuels? Like, really, really bad. And we've already seen, especially in the last year, the confluence of like the Arctic is on fire, in addition to California, and the record hurricane seasons and the floods and the droughts, and it's all happening at the same time. It's bad enough now, but imagine what it would be like if we burned fossil fuels at this rate for another 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but that doesn't tell us much about what we can each do. It just scares us often into inaction because it's so big and horrible.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I try to think about is how can we each find our role as a part of the solutions, whether it's our full-time job or our volunteer work, or just shifting the way that we show up in the world. And so the way to welcome people in to climate work is to talk about what's next, because the vast majority of people are at the stage where they're concerned. And the question is, well, what do we do with that concern? What are the solutions that we have available? Which ones can you be a part of? And so just thinking about the ocean as this big dying blue thing doesn't really get us anywhere, because what do we do if we're sad about coral reefs, right? What do we do if we're worried about overfishing? And so in the context of climate in particular, the ocean has absorbed over 90% of the heat that we've trapped by burning fossil fuels and putting greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So this planet would be dozens of degrees hotter if it weren't for the ocean absorbing nearly all of that excess heat that we've trapped with greenhouse gases. If that's not heroic, I don't know what is, right? And the ocean has also absorbed about 30% of the carbon dioxide we've emitted by burning fossil fuels, and that's made the ocean much more acidic. It's changed the chemistry of seawater globally, which has these knock-on effects, right? If you're trying to build a shell and the water is more acidic, it makes it harder to build a shell, or you navigate by smell in the water, and also the water is entirely different. You may not smell home, or you may not smell predators coming. So there's big problems. But the fact that the ocean is so incredible at buffering the impacts of climate change and coastal ecosystems, that those mangroves and seagrasses and wetlands, coral reefs, oyster reefs, they're physically protecting us from storms at the same time as drawing down tons of carbon out of the atmosphere. So I think for me, focusing on that is just much more interesting. How can we protect and restore those coastal ecosystems? In New York, where I live, when we had this big Hurricane Sandy, already about 85% of the wetlands in the New York and New Jersey area had been destroyed by coastal development, all the construction and buildings. But the 15% that remained prevented over $500 million in damage. So imagine if we had 20% of the wetlands left, or 30%, right? It really, really matters. And so I try to remind myself that, I can't save the world. No one can save the world alone, but that there are so many solutions at our fingertips, and it's really just a matter of figuring out which ones you're best suited to contribute to. And mine are these ones that are at the intersection of ocean and climate, and the think tank that I co-founded, Urban Ocean Lab, is specifically focused on policy for the future of coastal cities, where so many people live, where there's all these justice issues wrapped up in designing solutions as well. So that's kind of the meandering answer to that question.
No, it's fabulous. And I think when we think about our solutions, what we bring to it is going to depend on where we're coming from. And so I want to go back to another poll to ask our audience. This is a simple question. Are you part of academics? I have this assumption that a lot of people in this poll are either students or faculty or researchers, postdocs. So I just want to know the breakdown. I'm curious to know if everyone here is an academic, or I'm just filling it out myself. There. So let us know who you are.
Which one would I even be? Am I academic?
What are you?
Non-practicing academic?
Agnostic? You tell me.
Agnostic academic.
Do you consider yourself an academic?
I don't, because I don't have an affiliation. I consider myself to be someone with academic training, which I use all the time and is very useful.
Yeah. But you're not a practicing academic. So, okay, we've got about half of our audience is students, about a third of our student is not an academic, and the rest are other academics. That's very interesting. Okay, so we've got roughly 2/3 of our audience here consider themselves academics, which I assume means something, maybe not sciences, because the Water Institute does go across a whole bunch of different faculties at Waterloo, not just science faculties. But I'm going to transition now to a couple of questions about the role of science and scientists. And so, like I mentioned, the Water Institute here has 170 professors, more than 350 graduate students, and they're in the arts, engineering, environment, health, mathematics, and science. So it's all across all these different things that water touches. So here's a question from that perspective. Academics are sometimes cautious when it comes to engaging in politics and policy, because they want to remain neutral, unbiased scientists. So how can academics increase their impact while maintaining their credibility? What are your thoughts? What's your advice there for people who consider themselves academics here?
Did you come up with is this a question from the audience or your question?
This is my question.
So this is a question that is asked to me primarily by people over the age of 30 or people under the age of 30 whose advisors have told them this is something that they should be worried about. Because there is a massive generational shift happening where young people are like, we don't have time to even care about this anymore. We all just have to do what we can to save as much as we can. And so this sort of perceived dichotomy between academia and advocacy is very much crumbling before our eyes, because if you study something that is an ecosystem or a watershed that is falling apart, you tend to want to get involved, and sort of everything is changing so fast now that that more and more people are just sort of ignoring the fact that they were ever told that was a line not to be crossed. So for me, I was sort of I'm 40, so I was sort of at the beginning of that shift where I was like, I don't even care what you're telling me the rules are. I'm gonna just write a bunch of papers while coral reefs die. Why? Because that was my research, was sustainable fishing, Caribbean coral reefs. But I do have a real answer to the question, which is a repetition of something said to me in an ocean policy class that was taught in part by Dr. Jane Lubchenco, who is a marine biologist and was the head of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration in DC for a while, and she's now back in the White House working on ocean and climate policy. And she basically said, if you want to stay out of it but be helpful, if you don't want to take a side or be seen as non-objective, you can put the decision squarely on policymakers and offer your science based on what outcome they are trying to achieve. So to be really explicit about that, the sort of formula is, me, scientist, could say, well, Dan, if your goal is to limit planetary warming below 2 degrees Celsius, then the science shows that we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by X. And the science shows that the main opportunities for reducing greenhouse gases are Y and Z, right? So you've decided what the policy outcome goal you want is, and then the scientists can tell you how to get there. And so, but you can sort of say, well, you tell me, where are you trying to get? Are you trying to get to clean water? Are you trying to get to this? Are you trying to get to this? And then you can say, this is what the science says you need to do to achieve that goal. So you can pull yourself out of the goal setting part of it. And you can, and then I think that's when you also need to think about collaborations. It's so great that the Water Institute is so multidisciplinary, because obviously there's economic and social and cultural elements to these decisions too. It's not just natural science. But it's not something that I've ever worried about, because I never wanted to have an academic career. I wasn't going to be reviewed by a bunch of older professors who have a super clear vision of where that line is, who are going to determine whether or not I got tenure. So I just didn't ever have a sense of that pressure or need for that line. Because there are lots of scientists working in federal agencies who are helping to provide the data that's used to make policy decisions. And just because you care about the future of life on Earth doesn't mean you can't do objective science, right? Like I can be motivated by wanting no species to go extinct and still like count the ones remaining accurately, right? It doesn't mean your science is biased because you care about ecosystems.
It gives me a lot of hope that you're seeing that transition from the old guard to the younger. That's really great to see.
These days, I tell you, they're like
those
ready.
Kids. Yeah, good. Well, good, because it's in their hands. Yeah, thank goodness. Well, I have a question here from a graduate student at the Water Institute that was submitted ahead of time. Do you believe the politics of climate change drive research? For example, does the denial of climate change, which is rearing its head in Canada right now, does the denial of climate change draw resources into proving that it's an issue that otherwise would go into solutions? How much of a problem do you see with that?
I do not see that as a problem because the science has been clear for decades, including the science done by fossil fuel companies themselves in the 70s and 80s. So, and there's actually not from my understanding, what's happening in climate science right now, a lot of it is like refining models and projections and understanding, additional variables, whether that's clouds or permafrost or, thermohaline circulation. Like there's more we can understand about natural cycles and how greenhouse gases are affecting them. We can understand that with an increasing level of detail, but we're not like proving whether or not it's happening. We're understanding in more detail exactly the mechanisms and the magnitude. So I actually don't think people are really wasting energy on like the scientific research side to prove it, because like there's not really much more you can do to prove it. Like it is. But I think and the important work of doing the sort of local scale predictions of how climate is going to affect different parts of the world is really important. But that's not proving climate change, just helping people understand how that will affect them where they are, which can be very valuable in having conversations with people about like, well, the rainfall has been so different. That's actually because of our climate has changed, right? So it enables more local conversations, which is great. But social science, yes. Like there's a lot of social science that's happening that's like, how do you change people's minds? And like, what are the ways to sort of help people understand and embrace the realities of climate science? So on the social science side, it's taking up a lot of attention. On the natural science side, I would say not really that much at all.
I mean, when you look at the climate crisis, or even when you look at the COVID-19 pandemic, misinformation and conspiracy theories and just all that distraction seems at first glance like it's taking away from the conversation that needs to happen. But in a sense, isn't it really the conversation that needs to happen itself? Because if you can't get half of people on board with a solution, I mean, is it possible to do it in spite of those people, or do you have to get those people converted over to taking this seriously before you're able to move forward?
Well, it's not half, which is the good news, right? In the US, I don't know the numbers for Canada, but in the US, there are only 8% of Americans, the lowest it's ever been, who are like firmly in denial about the facts of climate change. 8%. Really? We can definitely solve this without them. They're loud and sucking up a lot of attention. I think journalism needs to do much better in how this is covered, because if we think it's 50-50, then we have a totally different approach to our storytelling, right? And to the reporting that we do that ends up being way biased towards like seeding this idea that it's actually a much larger group of people, which implies that it's like much more valid, which implies that we should give them more time and attention, when really like 92% of Americans, like to some degree, there might be like dismissive is another like 10%. There's like pure denial, 8%, dismissive is like another 10%. But then you've got like, you know, the other 80% of Americans that are like, yeah, I guess this is happening. What do we do about it? Mm-hmm. And so I think it's important to understand, to talk about our understanding of the climate crisis and like which solutions we want to see our governments do, our corporations take the lead on, how we want to participate. Because when we don't talk about it, like we think that there are more deniers than there are, because people assume that they like would get into an argument and like maybe this person doesn't believe it, and so like you want to talk about it and they want to talk about it, but you're both scared the one is going to be a denier, and then we end up living in this world where people don't talk about the climate crisis enough. And so it feels like, well, if it was really a big deal, people would be talking about it, but we're all just scared to find that like 1 in 10 who's a denier, which ends up setting us back a lot, because when we could be talking about solutions, we're just like all tiptoeing around, trying not to offend anyone. So I think there's, we just need to be like a bit more courageous. And you know, maybe 1 in 10 times someone will yell at you and then you can just walk away or shut your laptop in these modern times. Right. I don't spend any of my time trying to convince climate science deniers. It's not the way I want to spend my energy. I'm like, I'm going to work with the other 80% or 90% of people, right? And like, how can we get the people who already understand what's at stake and are wanting to figure out how they can contribute to solutions, like how do we welcome them into the work that needs doing, is to me a much better way to spend my time.
Wow, that's a really profound answer. You knocked my socks off there. I'm seeing it all very differently now. I'm going to have a beer after this and reflect for a while.
There's really great polling from Yale and George Mason universities that's been over 10 years now, polling people on their understanding of climate. And one of the other things that they've shown is that like there's a huge portion of Americans who actually would do more if they had the right invitation from someone they trusted, who would show up at a march, who would ask their elected officials to support climate policy. Like people are ready, they are just waiting to be welcomed in, and because no one wants to do it alone. I think that's a super important lesson. Like, of course it's too big to do alone and it feels scary and ridiculous to try. And so it's about like, who's your crew? Like, who's your climate squad? Are you joining an organization? Is it your family? Is it your school? Is it your sports team? Is it your office? Like, is it your neighborhood? Is it an activist group? Is it a local chapter of something? And then I think people feel like, okay, well, me and these 10 people are going to advocate to get more bike lanes in our city, or municipal composting expanded, or curbside pickup, or set a deadline for getting to 100% clean energy, as they're doing in more and more places. Like, and those are things that a few hundred people can do. It doesn't actually take millions of people to make those changes happen. So I think that's sort of the next step. Like, the vast majority of us get it, but also the vast majority haven't yet figured out like where they fit into to being a part of the solution. Not as your day job even necessarily, but just like, what is the thing that you care about and can influence and that would like feel really good to be a part of. Like, I'm stoked that there are bike lanes in my neighborhood now. Right. It's awesome.
Yeah, you know, what you've brought up here really segues really nicely. I was excited to talk to you about science communication. So I was in academics. I thought I was going to be a prof. I was doing bats. I was flying them in wind tunnels. I was recording with high-speed cameras. And then I got veered off to the side and ended up as a TV host talking about science on TV and talking about a whole bunch of different stuff. Bats whenever I can, but other things. And I remember some advice that I got when I was a graduate student, and I give this advice to everybody who will listen, because it was advice intended for me on the career path of becoming an academic. And but I found that it works anyway. The advice was there's an inverse relationship between the apparent urgency of things and their actual importance. So that's Rick Harrison at Cornell University said that. And so in other words, the things that are the most important are the ones that are the easiest to put on the back burner. And so when it comes to communicating the climate crisis to your audience.
Like my email inbox. You're like, oh, that one's hard. Let me just answer these little ones first. And then 2 weeks later.
Yeah, exactly. Or how I spend my day. Do I deal with my emails, or do I do something that's going to have a long-term impact, work on that paper, whatever it is. So, lately there are, you have this audience that you're trying to reach, and there's no shortage of dumpster fires going on right now. Not as many as there were before the last US election, I would argue, but still lots of dumpster fires. And so one question is, how do you get people to put their energy into what you're talking about when sometimes I know it's a big deal, but isn't that a couple years away? Right now, I really have to focus on this thing I'm outraged about on Facebook. I'll get back to you. How do you get people's attention and momentum and shift it onto what you're talking about?
Delete Facebook. Can that be the answer? I deleted my Facebook account like the day the Cambridge Analytica scandal broke and never looked back. Yeah. I do have Twitter and Instagram though, and I find those to be like much to be useful. But I think so.
But how do you get that audience's attention?
So
it's not so much how do you avoid distractions yourself.
A lot. I have like interpretive dance moves. It depends on the audience, as you know. But I think specifically about like drawing people in, I think to me it's really about joy. Like we can take the climate crisis seriously without taking ourselves too seriously, right? And that's a super important distinction to me. Like for anyone who's listened to my podcast, How to Save a Planet, like we crack a lot of jokes, but we're still like 100% focused on climate solutions, right? Because like we're humans and we can't just be serious and miserable all the time, or else we would just give up or not be very effective because like no one would want to come to that party. Like I think of like climate work as like, how do we throw a party that people want to come to? And like, if it's going to be a potluck, you know that if people don't take it seriously and aren't excited about the party, they will just bring chips and hummus from the store and they will not actually like contribute their best, right? So like, how do you do the kind of party where everyone wants to bring their best? And so when I think about the role that each person can play, I think about it like a Venn diagram with like 3 overlapping circles, right? And one is, what are you good at? What skills do you have? What network? What resources? What's your magic that you can contribute? And the other, the second circle is like, what is the work that needs doing, right? There are so many things that need to be done. No one can do all of them. Like, is there a specific climate solution or 2 or 3 that are connected that you want to contribute to? And so those 2 circles overlap. And then the third one, which I always put at the top, is joy. Like, what gets you out of bed in the morning? Like, what do you love doing? And then figure out whether it's your full-time job or your side hustle, your volunteer work, or just like how you want to be a part of the world. Like, what is at the middle of what you're good at, what needs to get done, and what brings you joy. And so this is my our creative director for the All We Can Save project, like drew a beautiful version of this diagram, which I just posted on social media if anyone wants to see this, what it looks like. And it's super helpful for people to figure out, because like so often we feel like we have to do something different to be part of the solution, when it really is like, Dan, you know a lot about bats, you're great at hosting TV shows. Like, are we doing a documentary about how bats are affected by the climate crisis, so that bat lovers will get more involved in preserving bat habitats. Like, what are we doing? And you love them and you know about them and you're good at TV, and like that work needs to happen, right? So like what that is for each of us will be different, which is important, because otherwise we have this scenario where like everyone's marching and donating and voting and spreading the word, which is wonderful. We should all be doing those things. But if we're not bringing like our skills to the table, then what a waste, right? If you're asking me and you and a carpenter and a teacher and a lawyer and a farmer to all do exactly the same thing, then like we're just not combining our superpowers. I feel like there's some sort of like Transformers or Power Rangers analogy here, but like I don't actually watch those shows, so I'm not quite sure what it is, but something like that needs to happen.
If the environmental communication movement goes back to the Lorax, it goes back earlier than that, but the Lorax is an important character, and you're kind of like the anti-Lorax, because you're writing your talks, your podcast, this conversation, so positive, but surely you have moments. Now, what is your philosophy on that? Do you ever show, but do you show that to your audiences or do you hide it?
Yeah. I definitely, like, when I read the UN report on oceans and ice that came out 2 years ago, I was like crying on the subway in New York City, because I know what those graphs mean in terms of the quality of life for humans and other species. And it's heartbreaking to think about all the missed opportunities to put better policies in place, all of the pipeline construction projects that are going ahead when we really need to be focusing on the shift to renewables, right? Instead, we're like committing ourselves to another decade or two of extraction. Like, this stuff is heartbreaking, it's gut-wrenching, it's stupid, it's just like the wrong direction, and it makes me angry and it makes me sad, and it means a lot of people will suffer needlessly, whether that's the impacts of extreme weather events or having years taken off their lives due to air pollution from burning fossil fuels, or having to migrate and leave their homes because you can't grow food in parts of the world anymore, leading to all sorts of refugee crises. Like, there's horrible things happening, and it affects me very deeply. But if we stop there, then like all we do is know about the problem, right? So I think it's really important to talk about the challenges we face, the things that are wrong, to continually remind ourselves of how high the stakes are. I don't like live in this world of like sunshine and daisies and like everything's be fine if we just do these 5 things, because no, like whatever we do, we've locked ourselves into some amount of change already. And the question is just like, from the range of possible futures that are still left available to us, how do we get the best possible one, right? Like, we're not going to have 100% pristine nature. We're not going to have nothing left, but like there's a huge range between there, and every 10th of a degree matters, right? Like, every species we save matters, every watershed, every protected area, every 10 parts per million of like particulates that we're breathing in, like I think that's also what sort of like gives me hope, because it's not a choice between perfect and disaster. It's like, how do we get the best possible outcome given all the variables that we're dealing with? And that's why the anthology that you held up is called All We Can Save. It's not called We Can Save Everything, Don't Worry.
Right.
And the subtitle is Truth, Courage, and Solutions, because we need to face the facts of how screwed we are, right? This is the question I ask every guest on my podcast is, how screwed are we? So I'm not like shying away from how dire things are, but courage, right, is the next word in the subtitle, and then solutions. So for me, it's not like hope and change, it's truth, courage, and solutions. And so that's how I think of this. And when I get interviewed, people are always like, why are you so hopeful? I'm like, I'm not hopeful. I'm just happy. I'm joyful. And people often confuse those things.
Interesting.
I love life. I love music. I love dancing. I love art. I love my friends. I love cooking, like whatever it is. I love books. Like there's so much that's great about being alive, even in the middle of a pandemic, right? I'm looking out the window at a tree that will have leaves on it soon, and I cannot wait. I'm extremely excited. And there are baby chickens arriving at my mom's farm next week that I get to hang out with. Like there's a lot of beautiful things about the world, and a lot of them are at risk. And so I, by virtue of being born with the gift of very stable brain chemistry, which I did nothing to earn, I don't get depressed by reading about climate. I just start to think, okay, like, what else can I do? How can I like help other people figure out what they can do? And then, you know, we'll like see how far we get. So that's how I feel about that today. But I think when journalists ask me like, what gives you hope? I'm like, honestly, fuck hope, because that's not going to get us there, right? Like to me, it's so passive. It's like, okay,
well, it's
great.
interesting
Like,
though.
what do we do with hope?
Yeah, I hear you that hope isn't going to reduce carbon dioxide directly, but if you're trying to build a movement, you've already spoken to this, that your hope and the way you give people something to anchor to in a movement, something they can do, I think that does make a difference. And you speak about, you know, work that needs doing and doing what you're good at. Clearly, you've
It's
found a way
partially
to take that
semantic.
hope.
I just have this like allergy to the word hope because for me it sounds very passive.
Yeah, I could imagine that.
Opposed to like truth, courage, solutions, like let's do this thing. Because people, when they ask me that question, they are basically asking me to tell them it's going to be okay. Like, what gives you hope? And sort of like the unspoken question is like, tell me I don't have to be scared. And I can't, because like the outcomes could be horrible, but it depends what we do.
I need to move on to my next topic, but I got a great question that I don't want to leave. And this is anonymous, so whoever wrote this question, thank you. Just looking for, and just someone who's in a graduate program, thinking about switching to a career in science communication, just looking for, just briefly, just some advice that you would offer about that transition and how a person can best do that, going from academics to science, from science to science communication.
I mean, if you want to, we need both, right? We need scientists, we need science communicators, we need scientists who are good communicators. I think it's just a matter of like matching your skills onto the work that needs doing, and which will bring you more joy. I think it's okay to choose the thing you like more because they're both useful. And to remember that this is like the work of our lifetimes, right? Like we have to deal, we're living in the context of climate crisis indefinitely. So if you just pick the thing that you think you can do for more years, or the thing that you think you can be most useful at next, even if it's not forever, like I'm not going to be doing what I'm doing in 10 years, I'll be doing something different. And that's fine too. I think, you know, it's not like we live in this world anymore where we have one job for our whole career and then get a great pension and retire and hang out. Like that's just not the way the world is really set up anymore in most places. So do whatever you want, but just find ways to pitch in and be part of the solutions.
my next topic is racial justice. And as I turn to this, I just want to remind the audience, please submit questions or comments that you have. I see them coming in here. Again, that's why I keep looking over to the side. I'm not checking my email. I'm looking at your questions as they come in. Yeah, and also just telling my mom how this is going because she asked. So it's been an historic year for racial justice in the US and Canada and other countries around the world. And you've written on more than one occasion that we can't solve the climate crisis unless Black lives matter. Can you explain what brought you to that perspective?
Being a Black person and not being able to get my work done, to put it very simply. To be heartbroken by the astronomical and deadly injustice happening in the US and around the world, and to be expected to still be productive while watching like police murder one Black person after the next, and it's still happening. It's just not making massive headlines anymore. That's the simple answer. Like, I am, of all the people that I know, I have like one of the best abilities to go into what I call robot mode and just like do the work, check things off the to-do list, and just keep it moving. Like, I'll cry for 5 minutes and then I'll just get back to work. But there was a point this last summer where I was like, oh, there's no getting back to work.
Huh.
And that same polling from Yale and George Mason University shows that people of color actually care more about climate. They're more concerned. White Americans, it's like 49% of white Americans are concerned, 57% of Black Americans, and 69% of Latino Americans. So when we think about building the biggest, strongest team, why are we not focusing on welcoming in people of color who already get it and care more, right? And when we think about the leadership we need, if we think about framing the climate crisis as a leadership crisis, we just haven't had the leaders that we need. We haven't had the diversity or the number of leaders we need. We need many, many, many leaders. Every community has to be transformed in terms of electricity and transportation and agriculture and land use and manufacturing, like all of it. And so when I think about how we succeed, I think, do y'all really think you can do this without Black people? And if you're just killing us and stressing us out and making us focus on all these other things to protect our rights to live and breathe, how can we help save the planet? It's extremely distracting at best, right? And so I think knowing these numbers, knowing that there are 23 million Black Americans who are concerned about the climate crisis, who have other very pressing concerns because of racial injustice, which prevents them from contributing their best to this other problem. It's just so ridiculous, and it's a recipe for failure. And so some of this writing that you're mentioning, basically a letter to white environmentalists in the form of like a Washington Post op-ed that was like, hey, you can't solve this without us. So like, please help us, help you, help save the planet. So just it's like, again, you know, thinking about the ocean as a victim versus hero, it's the same thing here, right? Like thinking about people of color as assets for being a part of the solution. Absolutely, communities of color bear the brunt of the impacts of climate change disproportionately, low-income communities too, without the resources to protect themselves in the first place or to rebuild and recover afterwards. So there is definitely a justice element to who's getting hit by the impacts of a climate crisis, but we do not talk nearly enough about what we are missing in terms of putting forward and accelerating the implementation of solutions if we're leaving like all this brain power and creativity from people of color out of the work. And again, that's the side that I tend to focus more on, is like shaking people and saying like, do you want to win? Because if you want to win, you're going to need us, right? Like we care and we want to help. So if you could just stop murdering us, we could be more helpful. And I know it feels like very ridiculous to put it perhaps in quite those words, but I do feel like it's that basic.
Yeah, I mean, it seems self-evident. When you put it that way, it seems so self-evident. But I think that, on paper, you think of the climate crisis, you think of human rights, you think of indigenous rights, you think about, you can make this giant list and all of a sudden you feel like, oh, there's so many places I don't know where to start. But the way you're talking about it,
Yeah.
it's all pieces of the same puzzle.
Yeah. Indigenous peoples around the world are stewards for 80% of the world's biodiversity on their lands. That is incredible because so much of the rest of the world has been destroyed. And so when we think about indigenous rights, making sure that those tribes, nations, communities have the right to continue to steward nature is critical, because without them defending, so much of that would be gone. And so and all the work, for years, I kind of thought my friends who worked on racial justice didn't get climate. And now I'm so glad that they're doing that work, because if we have thousands of fewer people in jail for ridiculous things, like having a joint on them and going to jail for 10 years, if we can cut out this insane mass incarceration and police brutality, then we have just so much more energy for other things, because there's a lot of other things that need to be done. And so now I'm just endlessly grateful for all the people who've been doing this work for racial justice for so long, because absolutely we just need that burden removed so that we can put our energy towards other things.
Let's talk about your book. So I have a great question from Miranda in the chat. She wants to share this book with her daughter, who wants to be a scientist and who also loves whales, the mammals, not the place, although she may also love the place. Is this book okay for a 10-year-old, or is it too sad? I guess is the question.
It's too sad. I think it's okay for a 10-year-old. I have a copy here. On the back is the names of all of the contributors. So I'm just looking. So it is very much solutions focused. It's the kind of book that you don't have to read every single essay. It's an anthology. I guess I would say there is a section called Feel, which is about how we grapple emotionally with the existential threats that we're living through. And that section is pretty heavy. Okay. So you might skip the feeling. But, I think we underestimate how much kids already understand. I have conversations with 5-year-olds who are telling me about mass extinction, because it's just it's in the ether for the way that they are learning about the world, that extinction is a problem and climate change is a problem. And I think sometimes I worry that if they already know it's a problem and then we don't engage them with solutions, it's actually more scary, because it feels like we're just stuck and we're doomed. So I think it's great for a 10-year-old. I may be a little bit biased. You could skip the feel section, but if she's already feeling things and you're worried she'll be overwhelmed, maybe it'll be comforting to know that other people feel the same way. I'm one of those people who listens to incredibly depressing ballads, jazz ballads, when I'm tired. When I'm sad, to just go further into the sadness and wallow and just be reminded that other people have felt that way is actually comforting to me. So obviously the answer is it depends on your daughter, but the vast majority of this book, I think, would probably be great for her.
Yeah, and I'm going to put it out there that
you can
anyone
tell
in
by the title, actually. The title of each essay will probably give you a good idea as to whether that's a good essay for her. And there's 2 essays in particular that are written by teenagers.
Hmm.
The first essay in the book by Shea Bastida, and there's one by Alexandria Villaseñor. So those might be fun ones for her to start with, to say like, what are the teenagers thinking and feeling about this?
Mm-hmm. The Water Institute is giving away a bunch of copies of this, by the way. So if you're
Cool.
thinking you'd like to get a copy, send an email to water.institute@uwaterloo.ca, and the Water Institute will set you up. So and then tell all your friends to make sure they pay for their copies. But these ones are paid for anyway; they're not stolen. So anyway, we're going to share some copies.
100% recycled paper, which actually made it hard to get enough copies printed.
I'm sure.
Crossed that hurdle now.
No, I know that I've spoken to other people who have tried to get their books published on recycled paper. It's not as easy as you would think, but I mean, it's another way that we're doing our little parts, I guess, to try to make the world better. And so, one interesting thing about this book is that you've chosen to have essays by women. And actually, in your introduction, you wrote, "The climate crisis is not gender neutral. Climate change is a powerful threat multiplier, making existing vulnerabilities and injustices worse." Do you want to just expand on that a little bit?
Yeah. In many places, women are already really vulnerable to a lot of things, to abuse and exploitation, to sort of living at the fringes of being able to protect themselves, feed themselves, provide for themselves. And climate change just, as you said, it just like makes everything worse and harder. Whether you're the primary caregiver for children and trying to figure out that as the world changes around you, or you're dealing with, I mean, it's a thing that I try not to get into too much detail about, because it's extremely intense in terms of often like sexual violence, because of the stresses that it's putting on society, and like the ways that that shows up psychologically, sometimes manifests in sexual abuse, as people are just like stretched so thin, and the mashup of communities during migrations, and the sort of typical example of like women are often the ones doing the small vegetable gardening and in charge of providing that for their families, while often men traditionally are going off to work for incomes, or women who are in charge of getting water, or whatever it is. Like if you are making a living closer to nature, and if you do not have as many resources, we know women often get paid much less than men, even for the same work. You just have less resilience, and more to overcome as more and more things are getting thrown at us. So this book is written entirely by women, in part because in the same way that people of color are often left out of a conversation on where do we go from here, so are women. It's been mostly white men who've decided who gets the funding, whether it's to do research or nonprofit work, who we're even listening to, who's welcome at the table when we're talking about policy and solutions. And so, at yet another conference where my co-author Katharine and I were there facilitating a workshop, we were like, this is just not enough. Like, you can't just parade out Indigenous people for an opening ceremony and not ask them what they think on policy, and somehow think that's going to be a productive climate conference, right? Like, it's just not going to get us there, for the very a strategic reason, which is leaving so much wisdom out of the discussion. Like, as much as white men contribute, you don't have all the answers, and we need all the answers. And so I think this book was born out of that frustration of like, we know so many incredible people doing important work that can provide models for future work that needs doing, so many insights that these women have to share, and they're not all going to stop their work to write an entire book by themselves. We could help collect some of these stories and insights and examples, case studies into one book, and then have lots of people read that and be able to learn from dozens of folks between two covers. So that's what motivated us, was to add to the chorus of voices of people who are listened to, and to be very clear, these aren't like the women leading on climate. This is really just some diverse examples, and diverse in every sense of the word, right? Race, age, geography within the US, areas of expertise, the types of approach, spirituality, like very diverse. And we focused on the US because the US is the biggest offender. You know, we're right up there with Canada in terms of carbon footprint, but historically, you know, our collective greenhouse gas emissions outpace everyone's. We're the largest contributor to the problem. We have so much to do in terms of solutions. And because of the way that journalism has evolved in the US, most of the reporting for a long time on climate was like, oh, this is going to hurt poor people and brown people in other places. And so we didn't really focus enough on like actually, and people didn't care as much because they couldn't connect with it. And so now there's this need to talk more about like what's happening here, who's leading here, what can we do here at home.
I have a question from Mark in the chat. The UN declared that the decade we are in is the decade of restoration. What marine ecosystems, coral reefs, salt marshes, mangroves, etc., would you say should be top priority? And do you think restorative actions will occur at all?
You're gonna ask me to choose between marine ecosystems?
Pick your favorite kid. Yeah, exactly.
Well, wetlands absorb the most carbon per square kilometer, so I think I might choose them, or mangroves. But luckily, I don't have to choose. I think the choice that I have to make is how do I spend my minutes and energy. It's not mangroves versus coral reefs, and I think that's a very important distinction. At the same time, like I have written in the past about how we are at the stage where we need to be thinking about triage. Like if we can't do everything, what do we focus on? So I do appreciate where the question is coming from, but I simply can't choose. But I didn't know that this was the decade of restoration, and I love that because we think about protection, we don't think about restoration nearly enough, in my opinion, right? Because we can actually bring things back. We can like have life flourish where it once did and should. So I think that's really beautiful to remember, especially in the suburbs, in cities. There's a lot of chance to make more space for life, to add more green things, and that's so good for our mental health at a time when we're all really struggling with COVID, with the climate crisis, with all of it. So I'm for that, but yeah, no, I can't choose.
All right. Well, yeah, and actually going back to something we spoke about earlier is the idea that you can put out all the benefits of doing all of them, and then other people are forced to sort of do the triaging itself, and you just continue to provide the information about what would the optimal solution be.
So my approach on ocean management in that framing is to think about zoning. Like, okay, if this is your ocean jurisdiction, what's going to happen there? What's the, where's the wind turbine zone? Where's the protected zone? Where's the fishing zone? Where's the whatever? Where's the aquaculture zone or shipping lanes? And I think that is we don't often think about zoning in the context of the ocean. We just think about it as like one big blue thing. Whereas on land, of course, we have like industrial, commercial, residential,
right,
and park areas and agricultural areas. And I think if we thought about the ocean more like that, we would think of the conservation and restoration as a piece of the puzzle, which would then, to be honest, like be perhaps help us have a more comprehensive conversation about ocean management and protection. If we're like, okay, well, somewhere in all of this blue, we need to be fully protecting a third of each type of ecosystem, which is, which was the goal when I was working on ocean zoning policy on different Caribbean islands. Like, that's the goal we set. We want to see a third of each marine ecosystem protected, but exactly where depends on sort of the local specificity. So that's another way to think about it.
I'm going to do another poll. So everybody get out your clicker fingers. This is about how optimistic or pessimistic people feel about the oceans in general. So I've tried to phrase this in a way that
the beginning and the end.
Well, yeah, right. Good point. It could have done, and then we could have published it. See, I'm still trying to get papers out. When it comes to the future of life in the oceans, how do you feel? And this is a range going from very pessimistic to very optimistic, and the middle is 50-50. So just basically, where do you sit on that scale? And I've been sort of vague about the question, but I want you to answer it as best you can. So I have to think about what I'm going to say. Yeah, I'll do that. Here we go. A little pessimistic.
Gravitating towards the middle.
Look at that. It's a bimodal distribution. That's really cool. I'm taking a screenshot of that. That's a really good one. I love bimodal distributions. I love when things are non-linear. Okay, well, that's really neat. So, I mean, we have a split where only 1 in 5 people is really on the fence, and then everybody else is sort of to one side or the other. How did you answer that poll, or how would you answer that poll, Ayana?
I didn't answer it, but I mean, part of the answer is like, what day are you catching me on, right? Mm-hmm. Like, I think my answer to that changes from day to day, and I am very pessimistic that the ocean will be as healthy 10 years from now as it was 10 years ago. Like, I don't think, I just can't imagine us doing enough that we're actually starting to reverse the damage in a dramatic way globally. Like, because I want a time machine, right? Like, I want to go back to when the oceans were much more vibrant and full of life. And so this is sort of a cheating answer, but like, it depends what I'm optimistic about. Like, is there going to be something left in the ocean? Of course. Are coastal communities going to have enough fish that they don't need to import food and can have food security? Like, it's already not looking so great for that in a lot of places, right? So it depends sort of which variable of like the ocean we're thinking about. I guess I would say I'm like a little pessimistic, somewhere between like, I guess it'd be like my average answer.
So but I mean, you're reading the...
And I'll tell you why. It's because I don't know what humans are gonna do. Like, if we get our act together, like, the ocean is resilient and can recover from a lot of things. It's hard to recover from absorbing 90% of the heat we've trapped with greenhouse gases and a third of the carbon dioxide that's changed the chemistry of seawater, right? Like, those things are not gonna take, even if we stopped emitting all greenhouse gases tomorrow, it would take millennia for things to re-equilibrate if they ever did. But I think the variable that we understand the least is humanity, right? Like, and I guess I'm just not optimistic about humans. I'm quite optimistic about, wetlands being able to restore themselves if we could like back off and leave them alone. But like, are we going to back off? I mean, I think because of all of the pressures that humans are living under, because we don't feel like we have enough options, we don't feel like we have enough resources, because so many people are stretched so thin, and are all these other challenges that we're dealing with at the same time, I'm pessimistic that we're going to devote enough energy to conservation and restoration in order to get the best possible outcome. So I guess my pessimism is like directed at the ocean. It's directed at humans.
Sure.
To be more clear.
And there are lots of humans that make me feel very sad about the world, for sure. Are there people for you who are just like a glass of fresh water? Like you just, every time they speak, you just feel better about the way things are going or the future of humanity? In other words, who do I add to my Twitter feed?
One of my favorite Canadians, Dr. Katharine Wilkinson.
Oh, sure.
Who is her new
and she's in here.
She's in here. Chief Scientist for the Nature Conservancy is her new role. She is very focused on solutions. Who else? Gina McCarthy, who is the head of domestic climate policy in the Biden administration in the White House, doesn't really do a lot of tweeting, but her approach to climate issues is through the lens of public health, which is very interesting to me. Like she sees this as an opportunity to really protect our health and well-being. I mean, I guess I don't like curate my media diet based on level of optimism, but on like who is showing me interesting angles of things. So there's this journalist, Yesenia Funes, who writes the climate justice newsletter called The Frontline, which is part of Atmos. And it's beautiful, her essays and interviews, and there's guest writers. And I've gotten a lot out of that this year, as far as like learning from more diverse voices on climate. Emily Atkin has an amazing newsletter called Heated that I subscribe to. And the youth climate activists who just give it to you straight in ways that us grown-ups kind of like tiptoe around. And so like, even if it's not optimistic, it's refreshing in its clarity. Like the moral clarity of these teenagers will make you want to step up your game. I don't know if it'll make you more optimistic, but it'll make you more accountable.
It's just same ends. So we're almost out of time. And so I just want to try to boil this down into something the audience can take. So audience members who feel inspired by your example, what does a person do right now, today? What do you want people to do in this moment to have the biggest impact? Not a year from now, not a career trajectory. What do they do today that's going to make them part of it?
Draw your Venn diagram and figure out what the center of that is for you. This circle of what are you good at? What problems or solutions do you want to work on? And what brings you joy? And figure out how to spend as many minutes of your life in the center of that diagram. I mean, emails don't bring me joy, but I do them anyway. But like, the projects in general do. And I think that's the way that we can stay in this for a lifetime, is we find our way to center that is for us. And I think so often the question that I get is like, what can I do to help? And I have two answers. Like one is like, I don't know, what are you good at? Who are you? And so that's where your Venn diagram comes in. But the second response to that is like, it's the wrong question to me. It's what can we do? And like, who is your we? Like, who are you teaming up with? If you are just sitting at home freaking out about your own carbon footprint, like it just doesn't matter. Because if you die tomorrow, but you were like the perfect small carbon footprint person, then like it just doesn't have the ripples that we need, right? Like this is not about individual action. if you want to take all of these steps in your personal life, that is wonderful. I do as much as I can too, but it only matters if you talk about it, right? If you're bringing other people along with you. So don't be like the obnoxious vegan or the person who yells at other people about flying because they want to go visit their mom. Like, that's just not going to help. But if we can sort of like lead by example and welcome people in and show them that, you know, the things that we're doing actually like are delightful, and give gifts to people that will help them see the ways that they could live differently. I do want to emphasize that individual action is not enough. Like, you can't change your light bulbs and avoid flying, and like that's just not enough anymore. Like, do those things, but think about what you can do that is like in these ever expanding circles of influence beyond your own personal impact. And that's like finding your squad, who are you teaming up with, and making sure you're like using your skills, the solutions that we need.
Ayana Johnson, thank you so
Bring your
much
magic. We need
for
you.
talking to me. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, this has just been such a pleasure. So yes, thanks to you. Thanks to the audience for sending in your comments and your questions. I'm sorry I couldn't get to all of them. Before we leave, I just want to thank all of our speakers, Sue Chiblo, Sandis Jamal, Nancy Gaucher, and again, Dr. Ayana Elizabeth Johnson. I'd also like to formally thank the RBC Foundation for its generous support of the Water Institute, making it possible for us to deliver this program. And finally, you know, before you close that browser window, do make your Venn diagram and think about how you can get involved and build your community and take this inspiring talk and let it change you. I'm Dan Riskin. Thanks so much for coming.